All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our final panel of what has been a very, very interesting day of sessions. My name is Jacob Eriksson, and I'm a fellow with the CEPAD project, and it is a pleasure to chair this panel. So we have got a wonderful lineup of papers in store for us. In the interests of order, we'll proceed in the kind of advertised order of the panel. So we'll start by hearing from Lucia Ardavini and Dylan O'Driscoll. Lucia is a research fellow at the Middle East and North Africa program at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs in Stockholm. Dylan is also based in Stockholm. He is director of the Middle East and North Africa program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. And their paper is entitled Renegotiating Citizenship, Old Grievances and New Expectations for the Social Contract Between Iraq and Its Citizens. Then we will have Bassel Salouh. Bassel is Associate Professor of Political Science and Head of the Politics and International Relations Program at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. And his paper is entitled Weak, Yearned For, or Absent, The Antinomies of the State in Lebanon. Then we'll hear from Jasmine Ghani, who is a senior lecturer in the School of International Relations at the University of St. Andrews and co-director of the Center for Syrian Studies there. I can see in her bio here that she also has a forthcoming book out in March 2022, which I'll plug, co-edited with Ray Hinnebush, titled Actors and Dynamics of the Syrian Conflict in the Middle Phase. And this afternoon, Jasmine's paper is entitled Escaping the Nation in the Middle East, a Doomed Project, Fanonian Decolonization and the Muslim Brotherhood. And then finally, we will hear from Lama Murad, who is an assistant professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Her research broadly focuses on the intersection of forced migration, local governance, and the politics of borders with a regional focus on the Middle East. And her paper is entitled Standoffish Policymaking, Inaction and Change in the Lebanese Response to Syrian Displacement. So, as I'm sure you'll agree, a wonderful lineup of papers in store. Right, so without further ado, I'll turn over to Lucia and Dylan. And I should say as well, if questions do spring to mind from our audience, please do pop them in the Q&A kind of panel as we go along. And then we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. But wonderful. Welcome to not always easy when we talk about Iraq. So wonderful. Thank you both very much. All right. If we could turn now to Bassel. Floor is yours. I'll let you know when, if we aim for 15 minutes, I'll let you know when you've got about 2 minutes remaining.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. So shifting gears a bit, what I'm presenting today is part of an attempt to rethink the state in Lebanon and what we mean when we talk about the state in Lebanon. The literature on Lebanese politics has actually a very big literature on the state and the role of the state in Lebanon. And what I'm trying to do is to reconceptualize and to re-theorize the state, the post-war state specifically, in order to understand how Lebanon reached the current collapse, how the alliance of overlapping political, economic, financial elites have managed the collapse, and more importantly, explain societal responses after the collapse. And so I borrow from Wittgenstein the idea of a picture held us captive. And I argue that two pictures of the state have hitherto held us captive in Lebanon. One is the institutional, the state, the picture of the state in terms of institutional capabilities. And the other one, which is a more recent one, is the state in the performative sense, in the state as affect and in the affective sense. Now, there is the earliest literature on the state in Lebanon is, of course, one that accepts or makes the argument that the Lebanese state is a weak state in terms of institutional capabilities. And if we want to impose on it the language of the early Migdal, it's a weak state and a strong society. And that literature, in fact, has rightly come under fire for a while now. And there is a sophisticated critique to the use of the term weak state in the literature on Lebanon, and the argument that this is nothing but the imposition of neo-Weberian concepts on the global South. And the critique to the weak state thesis has actually developed a new literature on the state in Lebanon, one that includes ideas about hybrid sovereignties, plural securities, limited statehood, and so on. I'll come back to this latter literature in a while. The second picture that dominates the literature on the state in Lebanon is the performative state affect literature. And here the argument made is that Lebanese imagine the state as a strong state, as an antidote to how they conceptualize the state, and that the state, there is an imagining of a state that crosses across sects and so on. Now, my argument, and this I develop in a chapter for a forthcoming book, is that neither the institutional state capabilities picture nor the performative state affect picture help us actually explain what happened materially in the post-war period. I would also add that even the literature on hybridity, on plural securities, on limited statehood that emerged as a critique of the weak state theory does not actually go far enough in describing what happened in the post-war period. And I make this claim because for two reasons. Whether one subscribes to a later Migdal, state and society perspective, or the hybridity claims, one cannot actually describe the way the alliance of political, economic, financial elites captured the state, the post-war state, completely, and used the state, now the picture of the state in terms of political economy, to achieve a number of objectives. So my claim is that neither the institutional state capabilities picture, nor the performative state picture, nor even the literature that has emerged as a direct critique of the weak state thesis goes far enough in describing the kind of, and I borrow loosely from Gramsci, integral state that emerged in the post-war period. Now, of course, the claim here is not that the state in Lebanon is not important or insignificant. In fact, there is a wonderful literature, part of which is the result of the work of Lama Mrad, Maya Mikdashi, John Nagel, Tamiraz Fakhouri, that emphasizes the role the state has played in the production of gender identities, in how the state fakes weakness and so on. And all these are forms of disciplinary strategies. But what I want to highlight, what I want to do is actually move to a much more material understanding of the developments that happen in the post-war period. And I borrow, as I said, from Gramsci, loosely, his term, the integral state, to make an argument for a new picture of the state in the post-war period. It's a picture of the state beyond binaries. And so it's a picture of the state that goes beyond public, private sector binaries, civil, political society, formal, informal sectors. And my argument is that what we actually see in the post-war period is in the emergence of this integral state, and the complete capture of the political economy and the institutions of the state by a political, economic, financial elite that straddles these binaries. And in fact, it is this capture of the state and its resources as political economy that allows for the creation of a new state form in the post-war period, one that looks very different from the pre-war years. And this is what I'm calling, loosely again borrowing from Gramsci, the integral state. Now, of course, what was the objective of this state capture? The objective was, on the one hand, to use the state in very typical neoliberal fashion in order to accumulate private wealth. And we see this done not just by the leaders of the former militias or the transnational capitalist elite, but much more importantly, to use the state in order to create the new sociology and sociological form of the new state form that emerged. And by the way, can I share something on my screen? Okay. So I want to show this table, which I think helps me make the argument.
Yeah, go ahead, Basil. I can't see anything up yet. But...
Yeah, it's coming.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
Okay, so this table was kindly prepared by Viviana Ai, the economic investigative reporter. And it shows us government spending for the period 1993-2017. And by the way, this table could not be put together without the Herculean efforts of Alain Bifani, who spent a lifetime recollecting these numbers. But very briefly, what this table shows is how the integral state operated in post-war Lebanon. So a big chunk of government spending went to the payment of interest on the debt and debt repayments. And the lion's share of this went to the financial elite. The second row gives us the share of spending for salaries, wages, pensions, compensation, and social benefits for employees in the public sector. And my argument is that by capturing the state, this overlapping political, economic, financial elite was also able to create the classes that benefited from the state capture, the classes of partisans who now produced a new sociology in Lebanon, a very big middle class, undergirded by material interests that were sustained by government spending. 11.3% is on electricity transfer, but the other row that I want to highlight is capital expenses, $15.2 billion. And this is on projects that were executed in the post-war period. And this also gives us an idea of the overlap between the private and the public in the post-war period, particularly when it comes to post-war reconstruction. So my argument then is that this integral state helps us to understand the kind of social forms that emerged and were constructed by the post-war elite, by the post-war political economic elite, to fit and to sustain the kind of state form that was created in the post-war period. Now, very briefly, why do I make this argument? I make this argument because I think we need to bring back into our discussions of Lebanon materiality and the importance of materiality and the construction of the post-war order. But also because I think that a political economic explanation of the post-war order, borrowing from Antonio Gramsci, but other people as well, helps us to explain three things that the other pictures of the state cannot explain. It helps us to explain how we got to the current financial, fiscal, socioeconomic collapse, because we can root this in the political economy of the post-war period and how the political economy of the state was used to create new social classes and new sectarian constituencies. But it also helps us to explain the societal response or the lack of it after this financial collapse, in the sense that if we again borrow from Gramsci and we link the material, the political economy, to the organizational and to the ideological, Gramsci had argued very long time ago that that every order, every hegemonic order, rests on a certain material basis of consent, as Jaworski once argued. So what the post-war political economic elite does, by creating the new social forms of the post-war order, and by using the political economy of the state to colonize organizational spaces in civil society, and by destroying the distinction between civil society and political society, we're able to produce a certain level of hegemonic consent expressed in the weaponization of sectarianism, but much more importantly, to preclude the emergence of any viable organizational opposition to them. And I think this is what explains why, after the collapse, Lebanon is now going through a devastating collapse. Opposition to this political, economic, financial elite has been so difficult because building the organizational basis of any viable opposition after the collapse has been almost impossible. The third thing that I think my picture of the post-war state helps us explain is the fact that the construction of this integral state allowed the overlapping political, economic, financial elite to manage the collapse in the country, in the sense that they have been able so far to successfully preclude any measure of accountability for the present collapse. And they've done that by melting the binaries between the public, the private, the formal, the informal, and by integrally creating this kind of post-war order. They were able to manage to maintain control over the post collapse period, and they have done so, interestingly, not as the World Bank has said, through a policy of deliberate depression, but actually through a policy of deliberate destruction. When the moment came for them to pay through their material interest for the collapse, they decided to destroy society rather than risk their own material interest. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bassel. Not quite the same optimistic note to end the presentation, but again, I guess it's not always easy with the cases that we deal with. But wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, so we turn our attention now to Jasmine Ghani. Jasmine, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Jacob, and thanks to all of the previous speakers. And thank you to the organizers and to SEPAD for creating this community at the end of the year for us to reflect on these issues. I really appreciate it. And so thinking about the theme of this conference, inclusion and exclusion, my paper, this is actually from a paper that I've already written, but it's an ongoing project. I reflect on the concept of the nation, nationalism, and the construction of the nation state as something which is depicted, is presented as a unifying, cohering force, and especially in the context of decolonization historically for the newly created states in the Middle East, but that necessarily that vision and that blueprint of nationalism is one that is an inheritance from the West, and therefore is necessarily also constituted by coloniality and racism, which were the foundations of the formation of the nation state, even in Europe, and then is actually carried through as bequeathed to the Middle East. So that's my starting framework, right? Is that the decolonization that came in the early part of and the mid of the 20th century presented to the Middle Eastern states that are seeking independence from the European colonizing powers. The means of decolonization is actually the nation state framework. So tragically, decolonization is tethered to this existing format, which retains a DNA for coloniality within it, even after independence. So this is the first point that I make in the paper, this tragedy, and that's offered to Middle Eastern states and communities. And then I look at, or I apply a Fanonian framework, because Fanon recognized this inherent contradiction, right, between independence that is founded on the nation state and the coloniality that's imbued within it. And so he offers this a framework for challenging that, for refuting that. And a lot of his critique is leveled at actually the natives, the interlocutors that are able to maintain or perpetuate that coloniality in their own interests. A lot of the time, the post-colonial scholars will draw from Fanon's framework, some of the Marxist elements and the critique of the bourgeoisie on a class basis. But sometimes what gets overlooked is his critique on a nationalist basis as well. So that's really the thread of his work that I draw upon and apply in this paper. So I won't go into too much detail on the Fanonian side, except to say that the two key ways in which he proposes that coloniality within the nation state framework, which gets tethered to decolonization, can be challenged and refuted, is in opposition to national self-determination, which he argues is racist, ethno-supremacist and exclusionary. He proposes a national consciousness. So even though it's got the term national in it, he is actually rejecting the national framework. And this national consciousness is, it's a recognition of the need to mentally disentangle the colonized mindset from the Western colonizers. And that's achieved through a reassertion of indigenous native cultures that pre-existed before colonization. He also advocates to challenge the atomization that comes with the nation state framework is more of a regional internationalist solidarity. So deliberately, very consciously, purposefully seeking to transgress national state boundaries. So this is the framework that then I use to consider or compare the extent to which a very prominent but not state anti-colonial movement, particularly focusing on Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, whether they actually were able to meet some of those Fanonian attributes of decolonization that's able to eschew some of the coloniality of the nation state framework. So first of all, I just want to talk a bit more about nationalism so we understand what it is about nationalism that is racist and which is exclusionary. Obviously, it imposes state boundaries, but it goes deeper than that. So I'm going to start off exploring that a bit more. And in the paper, I talk about this constitutive role of supremacism and racism and the foundations of nationalism. And obviously the nation state and nationalism coincides with, or its emergence coincides with the so-called age of exploration. And so necessarily it's constituted by the violence and genocide, dispossession, and that was there inherent in its inception. And Deborah Thompson argues, to quote, that the nation state model, the making of the European nation state and its expansion actually lays the bedrock for entrenched racial orders of the modern world. So it's not just that nation state is something that is inhabited by that community that then acquires a nation state, but it actually produces a racial ordering. And so what do we mean by that? The nationalism actually props up this idea of a global binary between those who are civilized, or the races that are civilized, and actually have the capacity to aspire towards a nation, and those that don't. So just prior to the fallout of the First World War, nationalism and aspiration for a nation state were set up as the necessary markers of civilization. But also, by default, because it's a marker of civilization, could only be possessed by white, civilized, the Western world. So the early concept of the nation was held up as something that was a primordial destiny for those that are civilized, or to be able to acquire civilizational status, it was conditional on demonstrating that you can aspire to the nation. And what's interesting is that one of the justifications given for colonization of the Middle East and then carving up the Middle East according to the mandate system was that the peoples of the Middle East did not have the capacity to aspire to a nation state. And one of the chief examples given for that was the inherent perpetuation of religion and Islam in the Middle East in particular. So the Ottoman Empire, this concept of an Islamic ummah and solidarity meant that there was simply an incapacity for people in the Middle East to understand what national aspiration was. So this was one of the justifications given for colonization, and that if the people of the Middle East being barbarians rather than savages, and if they can be tutored, then there needs to be an example of civilization provided by civilized states from Europe, demonstrating what a nation state looks like. Now, this exclusion of non-white people, in the case of my paper, we're talking about Arabs, from this destiny of nationhood, it was actually challenged, of course, by a growing Arab nationalist intellectual movement that we will be familiar with, especially towards the mid and end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. Prominent writers and intellectuals like Abdurrahman Kawakibi, George Antonius, Rifat Tahtawi, Sati al-Husri, these are all very famous, prominent names of Arab nationalism. But what we notice is that rather than critique the framework for its racist and oppressive foundations, those early Arab nationalists, so we're talking before the Ba'athist movement, for example, Gamal Abdel Nasser's more third worldist Arab nationalism. Some of those earlier examples of Arab nationalist movements or intellectuals actually sought inclusion within a nationalist framework, and to almost demonstrate their likeness to the West. And you can clearly see that in some of Husri's writings, modeling nationalism on European nationalism, that they were not seeking to refute that framework. And what's interesting is that actually this movement inadvertently gets a boost after the First World War from an unlikely source, which is Woodrow Wilson from the United States. He challenges European colonialism, as we know, and he argues that Arab states or Arab peoples should be allowed to have autonomy against the Islamic Ottoman Empire and to carve out their own nations, to be given, I quote, the opportunity for an absolutely unmolested opportunity for autonomous development. And interestingly, it has to be within the nation state framework. And that's actually stipulated within his 14-point principles and in Article 22. So this is sort of a recognition that they had the capacity for civilization. So there's something quite tantalizing and tempting in that. It's an opportunity for these what can emerge as newfound Arab states to demonstrate their capacity for being similar to civilized communities in the West. So it seems to offer this possibility of this legally recognized nationhood for Arabs in a way that the previous European colonizers did not respect or allow. But what this did, of course, is that it meant that any aspiration for nationhood that's fulfilled by the Arab states, it's always going to at least appear as if it's modeled on the Western framework. And so this creates a relationship of subservience, because the West installs itself as a model for these newly decolonized nations to follow. So an apparent watershed in world politics, actually, for the Middle East, a lot of these Middle Eastern states, is successfully tethered to nationalism, nation state, and continued coloniality. Right? So it's this incapacity to ever truly escape the coloniality embedded by their colonizers. So as I mentioned, Fanon criticizes this framework of decolonization. He provides an alternative blueprint. So in the last 5 minutes of my presentation, I want to consider the example of the Muslim Brotherhood and whether they're able to meet and connect more to the Fanonian blueprint, or do they end up falling into the colonial patterns of nationalism and nationhood that was bequeathed by the West? And the point that I'm making in the paper is that even with anti-colonial intentions and alternative forms of national consciousness, just how difficult, because of the structuralization of coloniality, just how difficult it is to escape that framework, and that movements, anti-colonial movements in the process of seeking decolonization necessarily have historically pursued that same path, even though they began by refuting it and challenging it. So we see that in the early phase of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna, so the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, he refuses to pursue the notion of independence that's tethered to the nation state, that's tethered to that model. And this is really reflected in his writings in the early to mid 1930s. So in contrast to the, at the time, dominant Wafd nationalists in Egypt, so one of the oldest parties that had opposed the British and called for decolonization, Banna actually set out an ideology of independence that consciously rejected those Western frameworks, and his form of national consciousness that was this mental disentanglement from Western coloniality was to turn back to indigenous belief systems and values, which for him was Islam, and that would represent true autonomy. So it wasn't just a territorial decolonization, but it's also a mental decolonization as well, and that Islam offers the route towards that. Now, instead of seeking decolonization for the sake of national self-determination, Banna was very clear that for him, any decolonization of Egypt had to be tied to a decolonization of the Muslim world, right? So in the Middle East, but in other parts of the Muslim world that was also colonized, especially by the British. Now, the interesting thing here in terms of the theme of exclusion and inclusion is, of course, that the minute it's founded on these religious principles, on one level, it's hugely inclusionary for this vast Muslim community that actually is not tied to national boundaries, across continents, across ethnicities, but it also becomes exclusionary in a different form from other, in terms of those from other religious communities. So that's also inherent in, to some extent, in Banna's vision, but he's seeing his primary opposition is towards a nation state. So in the paper I produce, I provide lots of quotations from Banna's memoirs, which is interesting because this is his sort of personal account, and it's very clear his opposition to nationalism, and how he sees nationalism actually as a it's a source of racism for him, and he actually uses that word. He talks about it as being a form of racism, and that he seeks to overcome this loyalty based on what he says ethnic or racial lines. However, what we see is that there's a major watershed, historical watershed, that disrupts this program that the Muslim Brotherhood has for decolonization, which is the revolution by the free officers against the British. Now, why does that disrupt their program? Because now they have a competitor, unlike the Wafd nationalists, in Gamal Abdel Nasser's movement, which is also anti-colonial, which is also regionalist through its Arab nationalism. And so increasingly we see that competition, this rivalry between the two, means that the Muslim Brotherhood dilutes some of the anti-nationalist rhetoric, and you see Arab supremacism creeping in. Now, that's not a problem for Arab nationalist movements, but it is a problem if you're claiming to have an alternative form of consciousness and solidarity that is based on Islam and that overlooks ethnic and racial boundaries. So we see that the need to compete and the power dynamics against a fellow anti-colonial movement actually increasingly means that the Brotherhood is contradicting its own claims against the nation-state framework. So I want to finish with, in the last part, very last minute of the presentation, that what we see from, I go into it in more detail in the paper, but we see that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, under the leadership of its founder, Hassan al-Banna, initially succeeded in pursuing this decolonial non-nationalist project that initially mirrors Fanon's own vision. And he has sort of these two key ways in which he does it is by rejecting the Western nation state model, but simultaneously cultivating, disseminating an educational program to instill a deep long-term political consciousness that's based on more indigenous values that precedes colonialism. Despite those firm decolonial credentials at the beginning, that's there in writing as well as in how they sort of try to appeal to this grassroots social movement. The pressures of the nationalist competition, disparagement on one hand, and state repression actually on the other, causes the Brotherhood to then drift over the decades from these decolonial foundations to fall in line with a more nationalist, modernist, and at its roots, colonial epistemology. So thank you very much for listening. Look forward to any questions.
That's fascinating. Thanks, Jasmine. All right. And so last but certainly not least, we turn our attention to Lama Murad. Lama, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jacob, and everyone. I am going to be the North American in the room, and I have a presentation. I have slides, so I will share those just to structure. There's not actually a ton of content on there, but just to structure the conversation a little bit. Perfect. And I think you should be seeing it as. Perfect. Do you see that, Jacob, everyone?
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Well, so thank you all so much, and this has been really fascinating. So today I'll be discussing elements of a published paper, but which is part of a larger and in draft book manuscript on Lebanon's response to the Syrian refugee influx. And what I try to do is really situate and characterize the early period, pre-2015 of the Lebanese state response to the Syrian refugee influx. And while this paper is really focused on this case study, I'd welcome thoughts and reflections on how, perhaps, building on some of the reflections of Bassett, how we can think of this as a sort of broader policy practice in Lebanon, and whether and how inaction is characteristic of central state policy in many other arenas. An overarching question that I really have is what drives policymaking in a state that lacks the will, not to say the capacity, coming back to some of these questions about the weak state, to design policy from above. So first, I want to propose that rather than understanding this early period as one of state absence or of a weak state, it's important to look at the ways in which a deliberate policy in which inaction was a deliberate policy in and of itself, and to understand its effects on enabling, structuring, and even encouraging a set of responses by other major actors within this policy area, namely international agencies and NGOs and municipalities, on the other hand. So in this, I build on work in policy studies and in comparative politics that has encouraged a move away from an emphasis on an active and observable intervention as the only type of policymaking, and to take seriously the critical role that inaction can play in shaping outcomes. Too often, as I think many of the authors here today also kind of can allude to, particularly in countries in the global south, state inaction is often understood primarily as a reflection of state incapacity or weakness, obscuring, I think, the important ways in which, and here I'm quoting from Slater and Kim, how variations in governance practices can arise from variations in state appetites, and not only from variations in state capacities to govern. So key questions that emerge from this literature and that I hope to take on really in my broader book project is, how do we identify inaction and its drivers, and whether those are deliberate, inadvertent, constrained, and how broadly we can understand its outcomes. What are the range of outcomes that we can derive from inaction? So in this paper, I try to demonstrate that one set of outcomes that we can hopefully sort of identify is actually the ways in which inaction can enable other actors to emerge and to take on a policy arena. And moreover, we can identify how inaction shapes and structures these responses, so the responses of these other actors. So as Slater and Kim argue, this understanding of this state, which they coin as the standoffish state, which is why it's in quotes in the title, it's a borrowing from them, stands in contrast to the traditional Weberian notion of a state primarily interested in homogenization, centralization, and monopolization. And it's also a corrective to the more contemporary notion advanced by Scott of the state as a project invested in imposing legibility and standardization, particularly as Slater and Kim highlight, in relation to populations who lack substantial economic or political resources to the state. A policy of standoffishness can be very appealing when the primary motivation is to maintain power and minimize political challenges. So it's in this vein that I take on the case of Lebanese central government's response to the Syrian refugee influx up until early 2015, and what has been called by many, but at earliest by Karim al-Mufti, as the policy of no policy. And during this period, Lebanon becomes the largest per capita host of refugees in the world, but it's also, from 2011 to 2015, a time where the Lebanese central authorities prefer to have minimal, if no involvement in the regulation of Syrians within their borders. And it's a period where they enabled and at times encouraged this space to be taken up by other actors. So this is sort of a very sort of cursory sketch of sort of the argument. But what I identify is really two critical inactions that helped shape the role of other actors in this policy arena. First is the lack of entry and border regulations, or what is de facto open borders. And the second is non-encampment and the lack of a shelter policy in any way. And this posture of standoffishness, to use again Slater and Kim's language, really changed with the pronouncement of the 2014 October policy, and that was implemented in January 2015. And that is recognized as sort of really indicative of a fundamental shift in the Lebanese central government's response to the Syrian refugee presence. However, what I argue in the paper is that this change from sort of standoffishness on the one hand in the pre-2014 period is not actually a change in aiming to render Syrians legible to Lebanese authorities, but rather to give greater leverage for central authorities to have more arbitrariness and ambiguity in their policy itself. So I won't really touch on that so much in this presentation, but I'm happy to take any thoughts or questions on that. So I'm going to take each of these two sort of central inactions in turn and talk about how they really helped shape the emergence of these other actors. So in the first instance, I distinguish between an open border policy and a de facto open border policy. The former implies an explicit decision to allow the entry of Syrian refugees into the country, whereas the latter, which was what was happening in Lebanon at the time, is a policy of inaction where Syrians continued to enter the country under the pre-existing categories, and that critically no provisions were put in place to distinguish between Syrians fleeing conflict and refugees and Syrian labor migrants, of which there were already somewhere between 300 and 700,000 in the country. So prior to the changes of the October policy and the border measures that were implemented in early 2015, Syrians entered Lebanon on the basis of the 1993 bilateral agreement between Syria and Lebanon that allowed for the relatively free movement between these two countries. Under these conditions, a Syrian individual could enter Lebanon through an official border crossing and be granted residency for 6 months and free renewal up to 1 year, and in practice for much longer. So importantly for me, this process really remained blind to the distinctive conditions and expectations of length of stay of Syrians who were fleeing conflict or who were otherwise not coming to Lebanon as migrant workers. So this had an effect and manifests itself in two primary ways in terms of the actions of these other actors. So on the one hand, UNHCR's registration procedures similarly maintain this lack of distinction. So any Syrian who arrived at UNHCR, regardless of how, when or how they arrived to Lebanon, following a short interview and the completion of formal procedures, would receive a registration document and access to aid and services in principle if they were eligible. Though importantly, UNHCR did not declare prima facie recognition or status. So it wasn't that all Syrians were granted prima facie recognition, but registration was done on the basis of an abbreviated RSD process. We can talk about that a little bit later if necessary. It's kind of in the weeds of the refugee literature. But importantly, they really also contest the government of Lebanon's different language around this category between leji'in, refugees on the other hand, and the preferred term by the government of nezhain or displaced, which is a word with less historical and potentially even legal weight. And what I argue is that this remained largely accepted by UNHCR, not really contested, but it would prove to be important when, and here I come back to this question of relative state appetite, when the central government decided to exert control over this process. And so first, in the aftermath of the mobilization of Syrians in Lebanon to vote in the Syrian elections, there were calls, particularly by March 14 leaders who were previously strong advocates, political advocates of refugees in Lebanon, for the removal of this label of displaced, which really wasn't a label that had legal policy, but was something that was used in ambiguous ways by the Lebanese state to all those who voted in the election. While this didn't happen, it was quickly followed by the Lebanese government asking UNHCR to review the case of all Syrians registered with UNHCR who had gone to Syria and returned to Lebanon after June 1st, 2014, implying that these people were not legitimate refugees, but potentially were migrants who, were more seasonal laborers in the previous category. So maintaining the ambiguity of distinction at the border allowed them to exert control at a later point. So according to UNHCR, 16,000 Syrians actually had the refugee status inactivated following this review. So this was not without consequence. I think it's important to know. And the conditions of these inactivations, not to say revocations, remained opaque. But they point to the potential for these ambiguous legal categories to be the subject of contention and ultimately control by the state. In turn, this would prove instrumental in justifying the government's decision to halt the registration of Syrian refugees in May 2015 on the basis of a need to overhaul this registration system, and it hasn't been reactivated since. So on the other hand, the ambiguity of status that was really sort of facilitated by that de facto open border policy was also reiterated to me by municipal and regional authorities regularly in Lebanon. So in addition to its legal consequences, as I was referring to with regards to UNHCR status, it also made the determination of who and who is not a refugee subject to a great deal of local interpretation, often based on criteria that had little to do with an individual or family's reason for fleeing Syria. I have a number of quotes in the article, but I won't sort of go into now of this sort of this ambiguity played out on the ground with municipal and district level authorities, claiming that, for instance, people, Syrians who were in Lebanon to work were not legitimate refugees and so on. So with the institution of the October policy and the marked increase in the role of the central government in this process, the role of local authorities did not diminish. Rather, they became integral to the enforcement of new regulations. For instance, local law enforcement became heavily involved in the detention of Syrians who, for a wide array of reasons, including kind of the deliberate policy of January 2015, did not possess legal documentation in the country. Moreover, local muhtars and municipalities were tasked with providing Syrians with many of the documents that were needed for the purposes of residency renewal, for instance. What I really want to highlight here is that, while this inaction in the early period allowed for the emergence of municipal authorities as really important actors in the response, they were then sort of folded into and it sort of embedded within the broader central state response after 2015, and ambiguity continued to mark that relationship and sort of who ultimately had authority. And the second critical inaction that I wanted to highlight was the government's refusal to build official refugee camps or to adopt any central shelter policy. So the reasons given for rejecting encampment in Lebanon relate in large part to what many have called a fear or a paranoia within the country concerning what could be related to the Palestinian experience. This interestingly runs counter to many theories in political science that argue that securitized perceptions of refugees are more likely to lead to a desire for encampment and to segregate them in camps. But importantly, non-encampment is really among the major distinctions that we can draw between Lebanon's policy on the one hand and that of neighboring states like Turkey and Jordan. But regardless of its motivation, this inaction on the encampment question created challenges for both UNHCR as well as local municipalities, who then became the primary hosts of Syrian refugees. So early on, this was, clashed with UNHCR's desires, but what ended up happening in practice was that it facilitated and encouraged greater interaction between international agencies and NGOs and local authorities in a way that had really rarely been seen before. And it changed the nature of engagement between these two actors, but it also changed the strength of municipalities in this relationship. So while the self-settlement of refugees also placed a disproportionate and unequal pressure on local communities and municipal governments, it also provided them with greater authority to, control access to aid, for example, or access to services. But interestingly, municipalities were still excluded from any formal policymaking role. And it was really through de facto action that they carved out a space for themselves as policy actors within this arena. And so what I really focus on in the book and in this paper is about also how this role and the emergence of municipalities led to the emergence of securitized policy responses at the local level, particularly in the form of curfews, but not only so. And these curfews were largely, I forgot to include a map of the curfews, but what you can really see is that they're distributed sort of across the country in basically every district across Lebanon. And what you really see is a proliferation of these curfews as central responses actually start to strengthen and try to take on greater roles. So it's not necessarily, and importantly, I think, a question of whether municipal responses are entirely separate from, but actually that they're co-constituted with central state responses and inaction on the one hand, and then greater control later on. So what I really want to highlight, and I think is the real point of conversation, I think, today, is that while local authorities and international organizations may appear as the central actors in the early policy response in the country, their ability to emerge as such can only be understood as a co-constitution of policy responses, and that they were enabled by key inactions by the central state. And I talk in the paper a lot more about the particular policy decisions that shaped those outcomes. But moreover, I argue that the sort of decentralized and lack of clear central state presence really helped the central state to distance itself from some of sort of the worst outcomes of the policy response, in particular the curfews. And it allowed them to distance themselves on the one hand, while also using the presence of curfews and tensions within local host communities as leverage to shift greater international donor support towards the Lebanese state, and in principle also to Lebanese communities. So again, coming back kind of to the strategic logics and utilities of perhaps some of the literature that Bassett was referring to in sort of performing weakness in this case in order to exert actually greater control. So I look forward to the discussions, and thank you all so much for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lama. And thank you to all our panelists for four really brilliant, fascinating papers. And all touching, I guess, on different elements of kind of this nature of the state-society relations, and how concepts of kind of the nation fit in there. So I can see that we have one question in the Q&A, but as we give our audience a moment to digest our papers and perhaps put some additional questions into that Q&A section, I've got a question for each of our panelists. So if we start with Dylan and Lucia, really interesting work, and I look forward to seeing the kind of written product of that research. And I wondered, the positive note that you kind of struck at the end there was this notion of a new sense, I guess, of, if we call it a sense of national awareness or a sense of civic awareness. And I was wondering if there is a specific role to identify here, particularly in terms of this idea of changing governance of the Constitution, and whether or not there was any reference from your interviewees to the constitution. And I asked this because I was at a conference in Duhok in Iraqi Kurdistan recently, where someone commented that he had challenged a protester who said, you know, kind of, we hate the constitution is terrible. And he said, okay, so which parts of the constitution is it that you take particular issue with? And they basically said, oh, well, you know, I haven't really read it. I'm not familiar with the details, but, you know, just all of it. It's all terrible. And so I was wondering if, yeah, there was a sense from any of your work about, you know, kind of knowledge of the constitution as, I guess, an important component of this social contract. And if constitutional change is part of this kind of governance change as well. Bassel, thank you. Really, really interesting work. And I think, you know, the distinction that you're drawing between the post-war Lebanese state and the pre-war Lebanese state, I think sounds to me like a really kind of novel way of thinking about it. And I guess my question relates to that relationship, particularly because, as you acknowledged, we have such a continuity between the wartime political elite and the post-war political elite. So I guess my question is, where does this new notion of the kind of political settlement that arises come from? This new, you know, kind of political, social, economic relationship that you're identifying? Is this something that is basically negotiated in the context of Taif? Or is this something that emerges organically somehow amongst the elites? So if you could reflect a bit on the kind of critical juncture, I guess, that produces this change, that would be really, really interesting. Jasmine, similarly, you know, kind of fascinating paper in terms of this relationship between the state, the nation, and our conceptions of you know, I guess, different forms of the nation. This notion of national consciousness as being distinct from the nation state, this kind of Fanonian notion, I think is really interesting because, you know, when I was giving my paper earlier today, you know, I was reflecting on claims by, you know, kind of authors who see the process of state building and nation building as being basically mutually constitutive and kind of inseparable, which suggests that there is an advantage, you know, played into the hands of, you know, kind of certain strata of the elite that you identify. So, you know, I guess on what basis, you talked about the Muslim Brotherhood and Hassan al-Banna, but on what basis, yeah, I guess, you know, do alternative notions draw on, or rather kind of what reservoirs, you know, kind of do these alternative conceptions of the nation have to draw on? And are these always destined to be defeated, basically, because you have an elite who has access to resources, who are able to, you know, kind of better manipulate the concept of the nation and how that evolves? So is this always a kind of subaltern project that you're describing here? And finally, Lama, a really, really interesting paper. And I think, you know, this notion of inaction as a political choice is something that, you know, again, I find very relevant to the Iraqi case. There was a colleague recently who pointed out that, you know, it's not necessarily that, you know, kind of, as you say, governance or a lack of governance is a sign of lack of capability. It might actually be that Baghdad doesn't actually want the responsibility and to be saddled with dealing, you know, kind of with all of these different localized political problems. So I think it's a really interesting frame through which to view governance. But I guess my question pertains to this notion of a lack of a border or a de facto border as inaction, or how we relate to the political preferences of some of the Lebanese political elite here. And I'm referring to Hezbollah, because from what I remember at the time, there was a lot of talk about the fact that Hezbollah obviously had a very clear political and military interest in the war and was keen to keep the borders open to avoid there being, particularly early on, any type of notion of unfolding crisis in Syria, that this was also, kind of something that was in the political interest of one of the key players here. So did that political interest also factor in, and how does that affect our notion of this kind of policy as a product of inaction? I'll leave you with those, and then we'll come back to a second round of questions that we have in the Q&A. But if we start maybe with Lucia and Dylan.
Yes, thank you. And thank you everyone for such interesting papers. I think this has been a great panel. I'll answer this, and then Dylan, obviously, if you need to jump in, feel free to do so. So when it comes to the Constitution, yes, we did encounter it being mentioned several times, and the perception of the Constitution and of what to do with it within renegotiating the social contract as a process kind of depends on who you're talking to. Like, there was a lot of what you were mentioning. There is a lot of criticism towards the Constitution and not as much as a clear idea of how to actually change it. But we found that this was not the case. For example, when talking to like women or minorities or IDPs, there was a much clearer awareness of exactly which articles and which laws and which policies needed to be tackled. So that's kind of on more of an individual basis. But when talking about the Constitution, the general approach that we found was that people refer back to the Constitution when they want their rights enforced. But at the same time, they also claim that the Constitution needs to be changed in itself. And there is a lack of knowledge on how to go about this and how to go about engaging in political processes more broadly that we found. And I think that's because a lot of Iraqi citizens are so alienated from the political process that they've also themselves identified civil education and political education as something that needs to be put in place in order for them to gain the necessary tools and the necessary skill to engage in that process. So that's, again, something that the people are asking for. But in terms of awareness, that varies.
If I can just jump in quickly. I mean, I think, yeah, people mention the Constitution when they're talking about the equality of services because it's in there and they know that. But I personally think you don't need to know the Constitution to know that there's something wrong with governance issues. I don't know the Constitution of Ireland. I can't quote anything from it. But if there's something wrong in the country, I can tell you what it is. So, I mean, I think it's unfair to expect protesters to be able to tell you what they don't like in the Constitution. I mean, and you mentioned you went to Hook. That says a lot. We're talking about a place, a KDP stronghold, and they hired constitutional advisors in this period and benefited a lot from this, from the rush process of the Constitution. So, I think, yeah, I don't think it's important to know the Constitution to see that in your daily life, you have issues with no services, with, unequal security, with corruption. I think we should separate these personally.
Great, thank you. Bessel?
Great question. I mean, if you want to identify a kind of a critical juncture or a period, I guess the second half of the 1980s is where the story begins. So now you're forcing me to tell you the story of my next book, but that's okay. Where, those militia warlords who controlled different parts of the Lebanese territory and were using their control of the land to make huge amount of resources, they wanted a prize for the peace, for putting down their guns, and that was what Ta'if is really. Ta'if was an agreement on now former warlords taking over or entering the state and taking over the state. So that's part of the story. Add to this also the remnants of the pre-war bourgeoisie that survived throughout the war. What in Lebanon they like to call it oligarchy, oligarchie. Mohammed Zbib likes to call it, and rightly so. And a new bourgeoisie that had made its money outside Lebanon, in the Gulf, in Africa, and these places. And so control of the post-war state allowed the overlapping political, economic, and later the financial elite to do two things. The first is what David Harvey has called accumulation by dispossession. So Solidaire is the greatest example. But the second one, and this is why a kind of a neoliberal account of post-war Lebanon is incomplete. The second is those who actually entered the war, entered the state after the war, wanted to use the state and the distributive abilities of the state to put together the new social forms that would undergird the new state form that emerged. And I think when you add all these things together, you realize that this is not a kind of a later Migdal argument about a recursive relationship at the juncture between state and society. This is complete state capture that dissolves the binaries between the state and society.
Great. Thank you very much, Basil. And I look forward to that book, by the way. It's a good
Inshallah.
Jasmine.
Thank you. Thanks, Jacob, for that question. It's a really good one. I think that's in some ways the key point of the paper is what potential or capacity exists, right, to escape that framework. I think that the starting point, and even with my students, it's remarkable how often they are, the idea that the nation is something that can be or should be decoupled from the state is often something that never occurs to them until it's first stated, right? That nationalism is an ideology that does not have to go hand in hand with the process of building or constructing or having a state. And nationalism has been so naturalized that sometimes it's not even seen as an ideology. And once you introduce something as an ideology, it becomes a choice. It's not something which is inevitable. It's something that's adopted. That once you introduce that, you then are left with an apparent challenge, or what's the alternative? That is because it's become so successfully embedded. And that is a part of the colonial project, right? Because it becomes a vehicle, it becomes a facilitator for the colonial project, and especially in exporting the colonial project. So I think that the first step is just to denaturalize the idea of nationalism and a state that has to be a nation state. We've had states long before the nation state existed, before nationalism existed. So yes, that denaturalization is obviously, it's so challenging because it often doesn't get called for what it is. What's interesting is that you're right as well in that you say that often in decolonizing projects, actually elites, post-colonial elites often embraced the concept of a nation state. First of all, because it is incredibly powerful, right? It may well be a deception, but it's very powerful as a so-called means through which the subalterns can claim their autonomy and their independence. The tethering is often occluded, right? They're tethering to a Western modernity or coloniality. And that's Fanon's point. And that's where the class aspect really needs to be retained in any post-colonial analysis, is because the reason why you'll still have that stratification of society, even after decolonization, is because you're going to have vested interests, and those at the top of that hierarchy within this new state are going to see that some of their interests align with their former colonizers more than those who are from the so-called lower working classes within their own, this newly independent state. So it's not only a continuous project for those who are seeking to decolonize, but it's a continuous project for those that are subjugated via other means, particularly class, against their own native population or those who supposedly they're superiors within. So yeah, I think it doesn't have to be nationalism. It could be any dominant ideology, but in this case, that's the one that's been particularly successful. What's interesting is this book, which came out at a similar time as this initial paper of mine, by Adam Getachew. It's a really famous book about world making. She focuses especially on African anti-colonial elites, and she doesn't really describe them as elites, but that's what they are. And it's a fantastic book, and it's demonstrating that you can have world-making, nation building that's coming from below and that's coming from the subaltern. But the thing that's really recognizable in that narrative is that you're only getting a vision that's from those of society amongst the African elites that the Western interlocutors still feel they can do business with. And even if you look at the archives in relation to how the British and the French and the Americans relate to these nationalist leaders that are coming forward in newly independent Middle Eastern states, the way that they speak about their personalities, they are highly conscious of their backgrounds, their class backgrounds. And there'll be certain situations where we can do business with this person because there's a certain moderation that he'll bring to negotiations. And when they talk about moderation, and this person is not a radical, what they're referring to is that we can, if we can't associate with this person, we don't see a commonality in terms of their ideology, nationalist ideology, in terms of their anti-colonialism, even in terms of their religion, we can still relate to him in terms of his class. So yeah, that's it's a powerful continuous factor in what might actually contribute to the ongoing coloniality, not just the nationalism that might be espoused. So thanks for that question.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Lama.
Thank you, Jacob, for that really great question. So I think you're really sort of touching at the heart, I think, of what makes studying in action really difficult, is that one, we can identify a number of different drivers or sort of explanations for why you might ultimately see an action, right? We can agree that the policy didn't change, right? But if the policy non-change is an outcome of strong policy preferences, for example, of really powerful political actors, is that the same as one that's the result of a gridlock, for example, in the system, or one that's just, because of lack of ability or capacity, right? And how can we sort of understand the different logics that each of those have? And I think that's really a big question in general in sort of social sciences, is sort of identifying the dog that didn't bark, or how to understand these things that are. But I think what in this case, what I think is important is that while I undoubtedly, I think certain actors like Hezbollah may have had a vested interest in keeping the border open, whether it be for themselves and for their policy actions, or because of, as you said, perceptions of how bad the situation was in Syria, for example, or the sort of reputational costs that might have to the Syrian regime. The truth is that Syrians were also allowed to register as refugees when, with UNHCR when they entered. So it wasn't just that, Hezbollah's policy preferences were enacted through the state. It was actually this ambiguous policy that allowed for the state to sort of exert control differentially and sort of when it chose to on the question of categorization, right? So it could have been that they said, okay, because of course UNHCR can't operate in Lebanon without the Lebanese state's approval or allowing them to. So it's not just sort of a pure manifestation of the policy preference of a strong political actors, in this case, Hezbollah. But actually we saw many of the main political parties, for example, largely settling on this inaction as a sort of as a way to allow them greater, I think, leverage in policy choices.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So we've got 2 questions here in our Q&A box. We've got one question here for Jasmine from Monsef Khadar, who asks, it was once mentioned that the concept of internal colonialism is not operational and even problematic. Nevertheless, do you think that nationalist elitism paid off by ensuring power, wealth, and prestige for the post-colonial leadership, and thus decolonization was a starting point for transnational cooperation between few? And there's that, I appreciate it's a bit long, but there is that question in the Q&A box if you have access to it there. Jasmine. And then Simon has a question here for Bassel. He begins, of course, by thanking all of our panelists for an amazing panel. But for Bassel, Simon points out at the end of the tractates, Wittgenstein throws his argument away, suggesting that we cannot describe the problems in language by using language. Is that the case of the state? Put another way, do we need to talk about something else other than the state? Thanks. Jasmine, if I turn to you first.
Of course, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Monsa, for that really interesting question. I think this is always going to be the ultimate dilemma, right? In any decolonial project, actually any project for justice, is how, to what extent do you have to also play a strategic game, that you're going to accept certain gains and compromise on certain aspects of the purity of what your goals might be, at least to make some kind of a headway, right? An example would be if you don't even accept the blueprint of the nation state and you can't even operate within an international arena, what does that prevent you from doing? You don't have a seat at the table. You cannot even be participatory to negotiations that might relate to your own domestic internal affairs. You can't participate in international treaties because everything is founded on this model. So at least to have the most powerful agent in those settings is a state. So just to be able to act as an interlocutor, and to demonstrate some kind of agency, do you have to accept some of those terms to begin with? And that might necessitate allowing the elites, the bourgeoisie, to rise to the top, rather than actually dismantling the class-based, not just the race-based hierarchies that might exist within, especially if that's going to bring some kind of validation. So this might be a strategic question. However, I think a good example that we can look to is the project of the Palestinian Authority. And this is why Edward Said was so scathing of the Oslo so-called peace process, is because it actually reflected to some extent exactly this, right? If we accept some piecemeal compromises and we can have some recognition and validation by the international community, we are able to represent ourselves as a quasi-state actor, even though we don't have all of the rights that other states do, and we can have a seat at the United Nations, but initially sitting behind Jordan, and then as this non-state observer status within the United Nations, we can start calling for some of our rights. And yet we see the corruption that exists domestically also becomes a facilitator for an internal oppression against people, which is then coupled by the oppression from the colonizer. So in the long run, it seems to almost always reproduce some of those patterns, except for the external colonizers. What's actually useful and advantageous for them in that is that you can throw and lay the blame on the indigenous community rather than on themselves. And what it also helps to do is to fragment the solidarity that can come from within, from the grassroots movement. So it's a huge challenge because it's a much longer term project and you don't see any gains in the short term, but the capacity to just reproduce and structuralize some of those injustices that then are harder to actually disentangle, right, from any project that you're trying to create. It's something that, it's not a small thing in that dilemma, right? It's not a small strategic thing to give away because of what you lose as a result of it. So it's a question of how strategic or how purist should you be, but also being absolutely realistic that what you think might be short-term compromises are going to become long-term structural injustices in the long run. Thank you, really interesting question.
Thanks for a very thoughtful answer to a thoughtful question. Bassel.
Thank you, Simon. Again, a wonderful question. I don't want to press the Wittgenstein code too much out of respect to Wittgenstein, actually. But what I try to do in this paper, from which this talk today emerges, is to say that, you know, we have these different pictures of the state. And we should not necessarily privilege any one of them at the expense of the other, but we should know what we are talking about when we talk about the state in post-war Lebanon. In fact, borrowing from Murakami's novel, the title of the paper is, "What do we talk about when we talk about the state in post-war Lebanon?" And what I want to emphasize is the need to bring back a kind of a sense of materiality in the post-war order, and to show how the construction of this post-war order involved the construction of new social forms that would undergird the new post-war state form. But also, as a political scientist, I need to make an argument that there are certain that some pictures of the state out there in the literature do not really help us explain all dynamics in the post-war period. What I also want to do is I want to push against abstracting the state and conceptions of the state, because I think that's actually a political elite strategy. Because by abstracting the state in Lebanon, they try to avoid accountability for the policies that have led to the collapse. I'll leave it here because I want to give Lama time.
Yes, so we've got, thank you, Bassel. We've got a question here for Lama that's come in as well from Lillian. In brief, in your analysis, does it seem like national level government officials aimed or expected to decentralize policies towards the Syrians to municipalities, or was this more of an unintended consequence? Either way, has there been any pushback given the empowerment of municipal officials by the central state to signal its ability to take over such policies if it wants to do so? Thanks. Lama.
Yeah, that's a great question, Lily, and nice to see you in the audience. So I think I don't think that there was a deliberate expectation that municipal actors would gain strength from this process. I don't think that that was an intended consequence, but I think it was something that did emerge particularly with, I think, the relative speed at which international agencies and NGOs shifted towards a decentralized aid response, which I think was largely, unexpected in many ways, at the sort of the extent to which that could happen. But there was an attempt, and there have been attempts by the central state to retake control of certain, particularly of the distribution of aid, because again, sort of part of the argument and what we see in practice is that this is in part a strategy to sort of be able to, again, play on this sort of ambiguous policy for the purposes of attracting donor dollars. In the 2016 London conference, there was actually a very strong push by the central state actors to try and encourage donors to not give funding directly to municipalities, but to give funding through Lebanese state institutions. And they largely failed to do that, right? So this is not, states can desire things and fail to achieve them all the time, right? And especially at this stage, Lebanese central authorities were not particularly, well trusted by donor states, and municipal actors ended up being a lot more responsive, I think, than many expected. And so there have been attempts to sort of try to take over, particularly, again, sort of the aid distribution, but that only really succeeded in the area of education policy, but not in other areas in Lebanon, where most of the aid continued to flow through municipal coffers rather than through the central state.
Great, thank you very much, Lama. I mean, we have a couple of minutes left, but I think we've covered an awful lot of ground here in terms of our 4 excellent papers. So I'm happy to give our panelists a final opportunity to make any comments or indeed, kind of reflect on each other's papers if there's anything that each panelist would like to say. Yeah, I'm happy to have a quick go round. Lucia and Dylan, anything to add?
Alrighty,
Go on, Dylan.
I was going to say nothing. So, I mean, I could talk about the nation state for all day, but as we only have 2 minutes, I don't think we should. But I would have a lot of pushback on the general concept. So that's for another day.
All right, wonderful. Thanks, Bassett.
Not really. Thank you so much for this wonderful panel and for the opportunity to participate in it. And it's rather late here in Doha, so.
I bet. I feel like it's late here and it's only 6:15, so can only imagine. Jasmine?
Nothing substantive for me, just to say thank you to everyone. It's been a really great panel. Enjoyed hearing everyone's presentations. Thank you.
Thanks. Lama?
Yes, I think I'll echo everyone and just thank you all. It's also great to be with kind of in new conversations and with a new group of people. So it's great to meet you all and yeah, I have a lot to sort of ruminate on from this. So thank you all so much.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just close by echoing those precise thanks from all of our panelists. I think it's been a really, really good panel. I have learned a lot and been given a great deal of food for thought. Yeah, thank you so much to our 4 panelists. Thank you so much to our audience for some excellent questions. Yeah, everyone get plenty of rest and load up for tomorrow's day of the conference.